There's a law that governs empires, not written in any constitution, not taught in any classroom, but as absolute as gravity. Every currency that becomes the world's reserve eventually destroys itself. And the timeline is remarkably consistent, 80 to 100 years. That's the lifespan. From the moment a currency achieves dominance to the moment it collapses, history shows the same pattern repeating across centuries. The Portuguese escudo, the Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, each one believed they had discovered the secret to permanent prosperity. Each one was wrong, and each one followed an identical arc: rise through trade dominance, consolidation through military power, overextension through debt, collapse through currency debasement. The cycle is unbreakable. And right now, in 2025, the United States dollar is approximately 80 years into its reign as the world's reserve currency. The Bretton Woods Conference was 1944. We're now past the historical danger zone. Every warning sign that appeared before previous collapses is present today. The question isn't whether the dollar will fall. History says that's inevitable. The question is what comes next, and how violent the transition will be. Let's start at the beginning. The first true global reserve currency of the modern era. Most people assume it was the British pound. It wasn't. It was the Portuguese escudo, and later, the Spanish real de ocho, the famous piece of 8. In 1450, Portugal became the world's first global maritime empire. They controlled the spice trade from Asia. They established trading posts across Africa, India, and eventually Brazil. And most importantly, they created a currency system that the world had to use to participate in this trade. The Portuguese real, which would later become the escudo, was the medium of exchange for anyone wanting to buy pepper, cinnamon, cloves, or any other valuable commodity from Asia. If you were a merchant in Venice, Paris, or London, you needed Portuguese currency to do business. That's reserve currency status in its purest form. The world demands your money because they need it to function. Portugal enjoyed this privilege for roughly 80 years. From 1450, when they began dominating the spice trade, until 1530, when Spain took over during the Portuguese succession crisis. 80 years. Remember that number. But Portugal's dominance was just the beginning. When Spain absorbed Portugal through the Iberian Union in 1530, they inherited not just the trade routes, but the currency system. And then Spain discovered something that would change everything: silver. Massive quantities of it. In 1545, Spanish conquistadors found Potosí in what is now Bolivia. This wasn't just a silver mine. It was the largest silver deposit ever discovered. For the next century, Potosí would produce nearly half of the world's silver. Ships laden with treasure crossed the Atlantic, flooding Spanish coffers with wealth that seemed endless. The Spanish real de ocho became the first truly universal currency. It was used from Europe to Asia to the Americas. Chinese merchants accepted it. Indian traders preferred it. Even in Japan, the Spanish dollar, as it was called, was the currency of choice. The coin was so widely recognized that it became the basis for the United States dollar centuries later. The dollar sign itself, that S with 2 lines through it, comes from the Spanish real's symbol. But here's what destroyed Spain. The same mechanism that destroys every reserve currency. When you control the world's money supply, you gain an extraordinary privilege. You can import real goods and pay with currency you create. Spain could buy silk from China, spices from Indonesia, manufactured goods from the Netherlands, and pay for all of it with silver they simply extracted from mountains. It's the ultimate free lunch. Except it's not free. Because when you flood the world with your currency, 2 things happen. First, inflation. More currency chasing the same amount of goods means prices rise. By the late 1500s, prices across Europe had increased dramatically. What cost 1 real in 1500 cost 10 reals by 1600. The silver Spain was mining had become less valuable because there was so much of it. Second, and more dangerously, the nation stops producing anything itself. Why build industries when you can just extract resources and trade them for finished goods? Spain imported everything from luxury items to basic necessities. The silver flowed in from the Americas and immediately flowed back out to France, England, and the Netherlands to pay for goods Spain didn't manufacture. By the early 1600s, Spain was drowning in debt despite controlling more precious metal than any nation in history. King Philip II inherited 36 million ducats in debt from his father. Rather than cut spending, he borrowed more, financing wars on multiple fronts. When the debt became unpayable, he defaulted. In 1557, Philip declared bankruptcy. Then again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596, 4 sovereign defaults in 40 years. Despite producing half the world's silver, Spain couldn't pay its debts. Each default destroyed international confidence. Lenders refused to extend credit. Interest rates on Spanish debt skyrocketed. And the Spanish real, which had once been the most trusted currency on earth, began losing its status. By 1640, roughly 110 years after Spain took over from Portugal, the Spanish system was cracking. The Dutch were building their own trade empire and their own currency system. The guilder was rising as Spanish power declined. The Dutch cycle is particularly important because it's where we see the pattern crystallize into something recognizable in modern terms. The Dutch didn't just create a currency. They created modern finance itself. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, became the world's first publicly traded corporation. Citizens could buy shares and collect dividends from Asian trade profits. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1611, created a marketplace for these shares. This was revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary people could invest in global trade without being merchants themselves. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, became the first true central bank, holding deposits and facilitating international payments. The Dutch guilder became the reserve currency for European trade. If you wanted to buy goods shipped through Amsterdam, you needed guilders. And since Amsterdam controlled much of the trade between Europe and Asia, that meant most international merchants held guilder reserves. By the 1652, the Dutch Republic's merchant fleet represented roughly half of all European shipping tonnage. They dominated the Baltic timber trade. They controlled the spice trade. They financed much of Europe's commerce through Amsterdam's banks. The guilder was trusted everywhere. Dutch bonds were considered the safest investment in Europe. But the pattern was already beginning. Financial dominance led to military overextension. The Dutch found themselves fighting wars they couldn't afford to lose. 3 wars with England over trade supremacy. The Franco-Dutch War against Louis XIV. These conflicts drained Dutch finances faster than trade could replenish them. By 1672, the so-called disaster year, France had invaded and the Dutch were forced to flood their own lands to stop the advance. The cost of defense skyrocketed. And here's where the debt trap closed. By 1713, after the War of Spanish Succession, Dutch public debt had grown so large that approximately half of all government revenue went just to paying interest on old borrowings. Think about that. Half of all tax money paying interest. Not building new ships, not funding new trade ventures, not defending the realm effectively, just servicing debt. The Dutch had fallen into the same trap as Spain. They'd borrowed to maintain dominance, but the borrowing eventually consumed everything. The guilder held on longer than the Spanish real. The Dutch cycle ran from approximately 1,640 to 1,720. That's 80 years, and by the time it ended, financial power had shifted to Britain. The British cycle is the one most people know because it's recent enough to be well documented but distant enough to see the complete arc. Britain's reserve currency dominance lasted roughly from 1,815 to 1,920, though some historians argue it effectively ended in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. Let's be conservative and say 1,815 to 1,914. That's 99 years, slightly longer than the typical cycle, but close enough to fit the pattern. After defeating Napoleon in 1815, Britain was the undisputed global superpower. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. The pound sterling, backed by gold at a fixed rate, became the world's reserve currency. British banks financed international trade. British pounds were held as reserves by central banks across the globe. The system worked beautifully for Britain. They could run trade deficits because other countries needed pounds for international transactions. Britain imported goods from India, textiles from Egypt, raw materials from Africa, and paid for it all with pounds that the world had to accept. But Britain made the same mistake as Spain and the Netherlands. They used reserve currency privilege to finance military overextension. By 1900, Britain maintained the largest navy in history. They controlled colonies on 6 continents. They fought wars in Afghanistan, Sudan, South Africa. The military budget consumed an ever larger share of government spending. Then came World War I. The cost was catastrophic. Britain entered the war with £650 million in national debt. By 1919, the debt had exploded to over £7 billion, more than a 10-fold increase in just 5 years. To pay for it, Britain borrowed from everyone. War bonds from citizens, massive loans from the United States. And, most damagingly, they suspended the gold standard to print money. In 1914, the pound was backed by gold. By 1919, it wasn't. The link between Currency and precious metal had been severed out of wartime necessity. Britain tried to return to gold in 1925 at the pre-war exchange rate. It was a disaster. The pound was overvalued. British exports became uncompetitive globally. Unemployment rose. The economy stagnated. By 1931, Britain abandoned gold permanently. The pound was devalued, and with that devaluation came the end of reserve currency status. Other nations started holding dollars instead of pounds. British government debt had become too large relative to the economy. The interest payments alone constrained everything else the government wanted to do. World War II administered the final blow. By 1945, British debt had climbed to approximately 250% of GDP. The empire was financially exhausted. In July 1944, while the war still raged in Europe and the Pacific, Allied nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes to argue for a system that would preserve some role for sterling. The United States sent Harry Dexter White with a different vision. America would provide the reserve currency. The outcome was never really in doubt. Britain owed enormous debts to the United States. American GDP dwarfed British GDP. The United States held roughly 75% of the world's monetary gold. The dollar, backed by gold at $35 per ounce, would become the new global reserve currency. The pound would become just another currency, no longer special. From approximately 1,815 to 1,945, the British pound served as the world's reserve currency. That's 130 years if you measure from Napoleon's defeat to the end of World War II. But if you measure from when Britain truly dominated global finance with a fully functioning gold standard to when World War I shattered that system, the timeline is 1,820 to 1,914, roughly 94 years. Right in the historical range. Now we arrive at the United States dollar, the current reserve currency, the one most people reading this use every day, the one most people assume will last forever. History suggests otherwise. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 established the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold. The system was elegant and seemed permanent. For 27 years, it functioned as designed. But by the 1,960 seconds, the same pressures that destroyed previous reserve currencies were building. The United States was spending more abroad than it earned. The Vietnam War, foreign aid programs, military bases in dozens of countries, all of this required sending dollars overseas. Foreign governments accumulated those dollars and started exchanging them for gold. France was particularly aggressive. Charles de Gaulle understood that America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them, and he exploited that weakness ruthlessly. The gold was leaving Fort Knox. By 1971, President Nixon faced a choice: either defend the gold peg by drastically cutting spending and risking recession, or abandon gold entirely. On the 15th of August, 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. No more gold backing. The dollar became pure fiat currency, paper-backed only by the U.S. government's promise. Remarkably, the dollar retained reserve status even without gold. The petrodollar system, established in the 1,970 seconds through agreements with Saudi Arabia, created artificial demand. Oil was priced exclusively in dollars globally. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. This kept the reserve currency system functioning even after the gold anchor disappeared. But the same pattern of previous cycles has continued. Debt accumulation has accelerated. In 1980, U.S. national debt was approximately $900 billion. By 2000, it was $5.6 trillion. By 2020, $27 trillion. Today, in 2025, it exceeds $36 trillion. The interest payment on this debt now exceeds $1 trillion annually. That's more than the defense budget, more than most federal programs. Just interest. Military overextension mirrors previous empires exactly. The United States maintains approximately 800 military bases in over 70 countries. The defense budget approaches $900 billion annually. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $8 trillion across 2 decades, all funded with borrowed money. The pattern is identical to Spain in the 1600s, the Netherlands in the 1700s, and Britain in the 1900s. Reserve currency privilege leads to deficit spending. Deficit spending funds military overextension. Military overextension creates debt that becomes mathematically unpayable, and eventually, international confidence cracks. The warning signs are already visible. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from over 70% in 2000 to approximately 58% today. That might not sound dramatic, But in reserve currency terms, it represents a significant loss of confidence. Countries are actively diversifying away from dollars. China and Russia conduct bilateral trade in their own currencies now, bypassing the dollar entirely. The BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems. Central banks globally are accumulating gold at rates not seen in decades, suggesting they're preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer dominant. The Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who identified it in 1960, explains why this is inevitable. When your currency is the global reserve, the world needs your currency to function. To supply that currency, you must run trade deficits, sending your currency abroad. But if you run deficits indefinitely, you accumulate debt and undermine confidence in your currency. Eventually, other nations start looking for alternatives. There's no solution to this paradox. It's mathematically impossible to maintain reserve currency status forever, while running the deficits necessary to supply global liquidity. Every reserve currency issuer faces this trap, and everyone has eventually fallen into it. Some economists and politicians believe American exceptionalism will prevent the dollar's decline. They argue that the United States is different, that American economic and military power is unprecedented, that the dollar cannot be replaced because no alternative exists. These are the same arguments Spanish officials made in the 1,630 seconds when their empire was crumbling, the same arguments Dutch bankers made in the 1,710 seconds, the same arguments British policymakers made in the 1,940 seconds. They were wrong every time. The pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. It operates on mathematics. Debt grows exponentially through compound interest. Economic output grows linearly at best. Eventually, the debt exceeds the economy's ability to service it. At that point, the currency must be devalued through inflation, debt must be defaulted on, or both. Looking at previous transitions provides insight into what likely comes next. When Spain lost reserve status, there was no sudden collapse. Instead, a gradual decline over decades. The Spanish real continued circulating for another century, but it was no longer the dominant currency for international trade. The guilder replaced it in Europe. The pound eventually dominated globally. When the Dutch guilder lost dominance, a similar pattern emerged. The guilder didn't disappear overnight. Dutch merchants continued using it. Dutch banks remained important. But financial power shifted to London. The pound became the currency of choice for international transactions, and Amsterdam's role as the financial center of Europe diminished. When the pound lost reserve status, the transition was more visible because it happened faster. Between 1914 and 1945, the pound went from unquestioned dominance to secondary status. The devaluations in 1949 and 1967 made it clear that Britain could no longer maintain its currency's value. By the 1970 seconds, when Britain needed an IMF bailout, the pound's fall was complete. Based on these precedents, the dollar's decline will likely follow a similar path. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a gradual erosion of dominance over decades. The dollar will continue existing, just as the pound exists today. Americans will still use it domestically, but internationally, other currencies will take on larger roles. The Chinese yuan is the most obvious candidate to challenge dollar dominance. China is already the world's largest economy by some measures. The Belt and Road Initiative is establishing trade relationships across Asia, Africa, and Europe. The yuan is being internationalized gradually, with more countries willing to hold it as reserves. But there are other possibilities. A basket of currencies might replace the single reserve currency system. The International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights already function this way to some extent, though on a limited scale. Digital currencies, either issued by central banks or potentially decentralized cryptocurrencies, could emerge as alternatives to traditional fiat currencies. The technology exists. What's lacking is widespread adoption and regulatory frameworks. Or perhaps gold returns as the foundation of the monetary system. This seems unlikely in the short term, but historical precedent suggests that after periods of fiat currency experimentation, societies often return to commodity-based money. Gold has been money for 5,000 years. Paper currencies have repeatedly failed. The pattern suggests gold will outlast the dollar just as it outlasted every previous currency. The timeline for transition is the critical question. If we measure from 1944 to today, the dollar is 81 years into its reserve currency reign. That's slightly longer than the Portuguese escudo's run, about the same as the Spanish real's dominance, exactly matching the Dutch guilder's timeline, and shorter than the British pound's tenure. History suggests we're entering the danger zone. the period where previous reserve currencies began losing dominance. But transitions can take decades. Britain's pound started declining in 1914, but wasn't fully replaced until the 1972. That's a 60-year transition period. The dollar might follow a similar trajectory, maintaining nominal reserve status while gradually losing real influence. What makes this transition particularly concerning is the interconnected nature of the modern global economy. When the British pound collapsed, it primarily affected the British Empire and its immediate trading partners. The world was not as integrated. National economies could function somewhat independently. Today, the entire global financial system is built on dollar dominance. International trade is invoiced in dollars. Commodities are priced in dollars. Debt across the developing world is denominated in dollars. Central banks hold dollars as reserves. If the dollar loses reserve status suddenly, the disruption would be unprecedented. Trillions of dollars in assets would need to be repriced. International trade would freeze as participants figured out new payment mechanisms. Commodity markets would experience violent volatility. Countries with dollar-denominated debt would face potential default. This is why central banks and policymakers worldwide work to prevent sudden transitions. Even China, which would benefit from dollar decline, doesn't want a chaotic collapse. The risk of global economic depression is too high. Everyone prefers managed decline over catastrophic failure. But managed declines are difficult to execute when mathematical forces are working against you. Debt grows exponentially. Confidence erodes gradually until it breaks suddenly. Systems that seem stable can flip to unstable remarkably quickly when tipping points are reached. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated this. One day, the banking system seemed fine. The next day, it was on the verge of total collapse. Only massive intervention by central banks and governments prevented it. The dollar's reserve status could follow a similar pattern. Years of gradual decline in reserve share, then a sudden crisis that forces rapid change. Perhaps triggered by a debt crisis, perhaps by geopolitical conflict, perhaps by technological disruption. The specific trigger doesn't matter as much as the underlying conditions. When a system is mathematically unstable, it will eventually destabilize. The timing is uncertain, but the direction is clear. Every empire that achieved reserve currency status followed the same path. Rise through trade and financial innovation, consolidation through military power, overextension through debt-financed commitments, decline through currency debasement and loss of confidence, collapse of reserve status. The cycle repeats because the incentives are always the same. Reserve currency status grants extraordinary privilege, the ability to import real goods while exporting paper, the ability to borrow at lower interest rates than fundamentals would suggest, the ability to fund military operations that secure and expand influence. These privileges are intoxicating. Every nation that gains them uses them, and every nation that uses them eventually abuses them. The abuse takes the same form every time. Deficit spending becomes structural rather than temporary. Debt accumulates faster than economic growth. Military commitments multiply beyond what can be sustainably funded. And gradually, then suddenly, international confidence erodes. At that point, the currency loses reserve status, regardless of what policymakers want. The mathematics overpower the politics, and the cycle reaches its conclusion before beginning again with a new currency and a new empire. The United States dollar is not special. It operates under the same economic laws that govern the Portuguese escudo, the Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, and the British pound. Those currencies all failed as reserves. They all followed the 80 to 100-year cycle. They all believed they were different. History says the dollar will follow the same pattern. The only variables are timing and severity. How quickly does confidence erode? How violent is the transition? What replaces the dollar as the dominant reserve? These questions remain unanswered. But the fundamental trajectory is written in 500 years of monetary history. Reserve currencies die. All of them, without exception. The 80-year cycle is undefeated, and the clock is ticking. If this gave you a different perspective on why the dollar's dominance isn't permanent and how history repeats itself through predictable cycles, hit subscribe. Understanding the pattern means you'll see what's coming before most people realize the world is changing. Because the 80-year cycle isn't a theory, it's a law. And laws, unlike promises, cannot be broken.